Welcome to the Lean Blog Podcast. Visit our website at www.leanblog.org. Now, here's your host, Mark Graban.
This is your podcast captain speaking. This is Mark Graban, and this is episode 195 for March 3rd, 2014. I apologize to you. I apologize to my guest today for the pilot announcement reference. I think you'll forgive me. My guest today is a good friend of mine, Steve Montague. We're going to be talking in honor of National Patient Safety Awareness Week. We're going to be talking about lean and aviation safety practices as applied to healthcare. So Steve is both a retired Navy pilot and a commercial airline captain currently. He's also involved through an organization called LifeWings in the movement to bring aviation safety practices and that culture into healthcare via a process called TeamSTEPPS, and he's also been combining Lean and TeamSTEPPS, something that we agree is a great idea. So I've known Steve for probably at least 5 or 6 years now. We met through our shared interest in lean healthcare and discovered that at the time we both lived in Keller, Texas, which is also coincidentally where Ron Pereira from Gemba Academy and my guest for podcast 181 is also from. So I don't know what's in the water or what's drawing lean thinkers to Keller, Texas. But it's always great talking with Steve. This is just our first chance to be able to record something to share with all of you. So I hope you find this interesting. I think we just barely scratched the surface. So if you've got questions or things you would want us to maybe cover in a follow-up podcast, please go to leanblog.org/195 and leave a comment. Well, Steve, hi. It's great to have you joining us here as a podcast guest today.
Thanks a lot, Mark. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked many times. The first time we're recording it here. Excited to have you introduce yourself first off here for the listeners. About your. I think you've got a really interesting background. If you can tell people about it.
Sure. Yeah. So I am a former naval officer. I graduated from the Naval Academy in '82 and went to flight school, and I was fortunate out of flight school to fly the F-14 Tomcat. I flew that on the East Coast, and I flew for probably about 5 years on active duty, and then I transitioned in 1989 to the reserves, and I continued to fly in the Naval Reserves until 2003 when I retired. In '89, when I left active duty, I went to work for American Airlines, and so I've been flying as a co-pilot and more recently as a captain for American Airlines since '89. And then about 10 years ago, I was approached by the president of a children's hospital about taking some of the ideas that have made commercial aviation as safe as it is today and helping to implement some of those ideas in healthcare. And so it's turned into a real passion for me, and it's what gets me out of bed in the morning. And it's just really neat to kind of like the work that you do, seeing the principles that have grown largely out of the manufacturing sector, but seeing how applicable they are in knowledge work and in healthcare, et cetera. It's just they're universally applicable concepts and ideas.
Well, and we certainly, we know, and the listeners, I guess, are learning now that we share that passion for healthcare improvement, and that we've really enjoyed, finding connections between different methodologies here. And before we come back and talk about lean later, some of our listeners might not be familiar with crew resource management. If you can define that and talk a little bit about the history of how that got into healthcare, and then maybe in the course of talking about some of that history, maybe weaving in how you got involved in LifeWings and a little bit about the work that you do there.
Sure. Yeah. So crew resource management. And for people who are in healthcare, crew resource management is now known as TeamSTEPPS. So anytime that you and I say crew resource management, I typically will flip back and forth between the two. But it got its birth in commercial aviation, and in the 70s, we recognized that even though it was even at the time in the 70s, it was much safer to be in an airplane than it was to be in the car on the way to the airport. we still were having accidents, not because our pilots were not very well trained. They had tremendous technical skills, but we had interpersonal communications and leadership and decision-making practices that were no longer adequate. And so we got to the point where we realized that really there were cultural elements that were missing. And so NASA became involved and created a syllabus or some ideas about things that needed to happen. And the airlines themselves each went and developed their own crew resource management program to teach pilots how to be more appropriately assertive and communicate more clearly, to involve team members to make decisions instead of just the old John Wayne command and control, I'll make the decision and you do what I say. And so implemented those through the 80s and a lot of false starts in the 80s. But we began in the early 90s to really see some tremendous results. And, well, I mean, it has made the commercial jet aviation in the United States the safest transportation system in the world. And it was not with high-tech innovations, but it was a very, very low-tech innovation, and that is changing the way people interact with one another and the culture that surrounds how we work. Mm-hmm. So that was that's the background on crew resource management, and it's still very much a part of my training. Every 9 months, when I go to training at the airline, I get refresher training on human factors and just the basics of crew resource management. It's that important. So about, I guess in the late 90s, some really smart folks in healthcare began to look and say, we have, a lot of our sentinel events are very similar to accidents in aviation, in that they are, one of the leading root causes is interpersonal communications in interdisciplinary teams, especially as the complexity grows in healthcare. We saw more and more and more sentinel events, untoward outcomes that were a result of many of the things that crew resource management addresses. And so over the last 15 years, a lot of smart folks have been coming up with clever ways to take the skills, lift the skills out of commercial aviation, and then implement them in healthcare.
And you've been involved in particular with LifeWings for how long now?
Yeah, actually,
an introduction there.
For 10 years, and it's been really gratifying. It began sort of as a fairly low impact on my schedule, and as we began to get more and more work, mostly with academic medical centers, I just, as I said, I have a real passion for it and thoroughly enjoyed it, and so. These days, if I'm not flying an airplane, I'm working with somebody in a hospital somewhere around the world, and like I say, the results are gratifying. So it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, and it's just a quick follow-up question. I didn't know the history that, as you mentioned, you said each airline developed their own approach to crew resource management. I'm curious, do you think was that because of differences maybe in each airline's culture, or was it just kind of working independently? Has that come back to become more consistent over time? Or I'm just curious why that developed separately, either good or bad.
So great question. I think that it was probably a mix of pragmatism and the airlines did have different cultures. They are a lot more similar these days than they were in those days. But certainly depending on how old how long the airline had been around, what part of the country they flew in, what kind of people they hired, each airline was different. So it would be difficult at that time to create a one-size-fits-all. But then the other part of it, I think, is it's very similar to the lean idea of small trials and. Okay, let's see what works. And so as the airlines all implemented their programs, some of the programs that were very, very successful and others were moderately successful. And so then we had the opportunity, when I say we, researchers had the opportunity to go and look at each system and see what was working well and what was not. And this is an area where aviation, commercial aviation, does not compete on safety. If somebody figures something out, we share liberally, and so we all learn from one another. And now, while a particular acronym at Delta Airlines may be different from what they use at Alaska Airlines, the fundamental principle is identical, because we do know what the evidence-based practices are in aviation.
So I want to, maybe building on that, talk about now some of the applications of CRM or TeamSTEPPS into healthcare, because I know we've talked before that this is by no means as simple as just going out and buying a checklist or having some carbon copy, cookbook approach to this in hospitals, which seems that is what the airlines did. They were developing their own based on, like you said, some science and some standard principles. Can you comment on that, or just some other thoughts about how this is developing in healthcare and how that's different than it was getting things started maybe in aviation?
Well, one of the things that we really surprised us, I mean, you remember, this is a bunch of pilots walking into a hospital, and one of the things that we know is that just conducting training in these ideas, people say, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But then they turn around and say, okay, so how do we apply this in healthcare? And so when we began to go and work, I mean, I remember when we were up at Vanderbilt University, and this was back in the early 2000s, long before the Checklist Manifesto and some of the other great things that have come out. They wanted to implement these ideas, and they said, okay, so how do we do this? And we said, well, okay, so how do you start a case? So an operation in the OR, how do you start a case? And the answer was, well, it depends. And no matter how much we drilled down, we kept getting the answer, it depends, and we recognized that there was very, very little standardization in healthcare. And so just as your listeners struggle perhaps a little bit, maybe not as much now as we used to, the idea of standardization in healthcare was not readily grasped and appreciated. So that was one of the things that we kind of had to make the case for, look, a checklist is not going to do something for you. You still have to do the work. You still have to, you're still going to have to use these skills, but you cannot, the checklist itself is not a fix. In fact, there's a great quote by Peter Pronovost, and I'll paraphrase, but he said, the problem with the simple checklist concept is that it's a technical solution to a sociocultural problem. And the problem is, and that comes right back to these ideas in TeamSTEPPS or CRM, is that so we use the checklist as a prompt to make sure that we are having important conversations. And so we not only can we cross-check to make sure that things are in fact completed. It's not simply a grocery list. It is a prompt. It is a structure to ensure that we each talk about what we have done to prepare for this case, and to make sure that we're creating a forum where people are going to ask questions to clarify information, and that they will to set a tone or an atmosphere in the OR that if at any time you have any questions or concerns, I'm counting on you to speak up. And so we really struggled, one, with getting the idea of standardization across. And of course, as you and your listeners have really helped us out a lot, because people get the idea of, okay, I see how standard work does make things easier and better and more predictable. And so we often, especially if we're working with somebody who is already on their lean journey, we often describe many of the things that we do as, this is standard work for teams. This is a way that we interact with one another in a very predictable way. I'm not sure if I answered your question there, Mark.
No, and you did, and I think there's a couple things I'd like to dig a little deeper into. I mean, for one, just reacting what you talked about with standardization. I mean, I think there's still, I think, controversy that comes from misperceptions when we use the word standardized work or standardization in healthcare. I think especially among physicians where people jump to a conclusion that means, well, oh, by standardized, you mean check your brain at the door and be completely rigid and inflexible. I'm like, well, no, of course not. That's not what we mean. But like you said, it provides some structure to make sure that we don't forget things, by using the checklist. One other thing I'd like to talk about here more is some of the structure about how to communicate more assertively if we identify a risk in the operating room. So I think we're still trying to communicate some of those subtleties. I think I saw Captain Sullenberger from now retired from the famous Miracle on the Hudson Landing, and he said checklists were helpful, but they didn't have a checklist that said, here's what happens if you lose both engines due to bird strikes right after takeoff and you're considering having to possibly land on a river. He said that the thinking and the judgment was between he and the co-pilot figuring out which different checklists to piece together to allow them to do that problem solving and decision making more quickly, which I thought was a really fascinating point. So I'm curious your reactions to that, maybe before we come back to healthcare, from your perspective as a pilot, your reaction to his recounting of that.
So you've hit so many things. Going to Sullenberger's event, US Air 1549, the Hudson River landing. You're right. I mean, I've watched that reenactment hundreds of times, and there's just so much there. You're right. They're skipping from this checklist to that checklist. But they had something standardized that they could fall back on and say, okay, I know that I need to get this piece done, and I know that this checklist will help me get this piece done. Once they had that part done, then they set it down and they said, now I need to do something else, and I have another standardized way that I can get this done. So it freed their mind up to, from the mundane task of what's the correct sequence of events to accomplish this, and allowed their critical thinking skills to be still very readily available. And especially Sully was doing a lot of big picture thinking. Where's Teterboro, which is another airport over there in New Jersey, thinking I might be able to get over to there. And
right.
He was going through, he was trialing so many different ideas, and the reason he could do that is because they, in a very, very short period of time, they fell into a script: my aircraft, your aircraft. And that, even just something as simple as that, so in healthcare, my patient, your patient, those simple words just speak volumes about what is your primary responsibility, your secondary responsibility, what is my primary responsibility, my secondary responsibility. Yeah. And you can drop into roles with just a simple script like that, and and so Sully said, you're trying to get the engines relit, I know that, and you're running these checklists, and I'm trying to think through this big picture problem while we try and get the engines started. But neither one of them completely dropped the other role either. Right. Sully was still helping to start the engines, and Jeff Skiles, the co-pilot, was still thinking big picture stuff. And he came up with a couple of just really solid recommendations in there as he was fulfilling his primary responsibility. So that's a great example of how the standardized work fits in so well, or this idea of standardized protocols fits in so well with completely unpredictable situations, and it gives you something to fall back on, so you are communicating very effectively.
Yeah, and so as you were saying, they were handing off my aircraft, your aircraft. Some of the awful stories that you hear back in the day before crew resource management was developed is that the scenario of a pilot and a co-pilot are each doing all these different things, and nobody was keeping track of the altitude.
Right.
And then and clearly that didn't happen here. Or if somebody, let's say if the co-pilot had a concern about altitude, they might not have spoken up. And so to build on that and bring it back to healthcare setting, I was able to set in a couple of years ago on I think it was a half-day class that Life Wings did with a hospital. And as we talked about afterwards, the thing I was really impressed by that was new to me, was not just checklists, because people out there in the lean methodology would recognize that as a form of standardized work that guides your work or confirms your work. But the thing that really impressed me was that standardized way of speaking up based on experience of how to speak up in a way that would be more likely listened to.
Right.
So I was wondering if you can tell the listeners a little bit about that approach, and especially how that applies, say, in an operating room setting. If you have a surgical tech or a circulating nurse, why would they have trouble speaking up, and how does this method teach them a better way?
Sure. And you really zeroed in on, okay, in my opinion, I think there are a lot of benefits to the entire package of skills and techniques that TeamSTEPPS or CRM bring into healthcare. But if I was going to pick the one that I think is the most important, it is a standardized way that I can be assertive without being aggressive, and that you recognize, oh, I see what he's doing. He's making an assertive statement here. I might be missing something, and it removes me and you, or any potential perception of adversarial relations. It removes you and me from the equation, and we're zeroed in on okay, what is the problem? What is going to happen? So if I'm doing my count, or if I'm the circulator, and I think we're missing the tip of the catheter, I understand it's not only do I know how to speak up, and I'm empowered to speak up, but I'm held accountable for speaking up. That's part of my job. Part of my job description is to speak up when I think another member of the team is about to make a critical mistake or is missing something. And so I'm the circulator, and I'm going to say, hey, I think that the catheter tip is missing. Now, most of the time, just a simple statement like that is going to fix the problem. But every once in a while, I mean, Mark, you can probably identify, every once in a while people are tired or fatigued, and or they are stressed, or they're thinking about the next case, or for whatever reason, they ignore the statement. And so now this person, let's say I'm the circulator, and I'm the one who thinks that this catheter tip is perhaps still inside the patient, and we're getting ready to close. You can see that this is a very stressful situation for me. Okay, well, I was just told that, it's not in the patient. Do I continue to advocate? Well, the tip is missing. What does the patient want? What does the patient's family want? Figure out where it is, and so they're counting on me to make some kind of a assertive statement, and for it to be heard in the context of, this is not about who's right and who's wrong. Let's talk about what's right and wrong. And so there's a 4-part assertive statement that is an effective stop the line statement when perhaps hierarchy or any other of the, any fatigue, stress, anything like that is becoming an impediment to that communication, and it has to get through. So the first part is you call their name. You call them by name, and especially if it's somebody that maybe you work with all the time, perhaps, and you're on a first name basis, perhaps you add their title. So Nurse Susan or something, to get their attention, and that's going to snap them around. And then you make an I statement of concern. I'm concerned, because that tends to deflate any perception of adversarial relations. Now you clearly state the problem, and then propose a solution in we or let's language. And so what you did in the class that you attended, Mark, is you practiced making that kind of an assertive statement, and where I think is particularly helpful so if you have created standard work with an organization, if your listeners that created some standard work, and it requires, and I walk in and I see that you are not in compliance with standard work. You are blowing it off. Yeah, I know, but I have my own way of doing it. It's a way for me to speak up and say, wait a minute, Jim, I'm concerned because we've created the standard work, and we're going to use the standard work. And if it's not working well, then we're going to continue to iterate to make sure we do get it. So it's always the best way to do it. Let's break out the standard work card, and let's go through it. And do it this one way. And if you have some ideas, let's add those in and let's change it and make it better. So I think that kind of an agreement among all of the stakeholders, all the disciplines, all the professions, that we owe it to the patient and their families to instill a culture where it's not just okay for us to have these types of conversations.
Right.
We must.
Well, and the one thing I really liked about the approach was the statement of, I have a concern, because I think Lean teaches us to try to recognize and state facts more so than just opinions or assumptions. And I was taught in the class, when you say, I have a concern, that's a factual statement that really can't be argued with.
Right.
And it could turn out that I had a concern. It turned, and that concern is resolved because the catheter tip is actually there, and I just didn't see it. Right.
Right. Well, and I think actually you've hit upon another important part of this is part of the culture also is that when somebody speaks up and it turns out that they're incorrect, you say thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for speaking up. I'll tell you, I mean, in my own personal life or professional life, believe it or not, one of the most difficult things to do when you move from the right seat to the left seat is drive around the airports, because especially back in the old days, every airport labeled their taxiways differently, and we've done a lot of standardized work on that, and there's standardization on that. And so, but there's still, every airport's laid out differently. And so getting from the gate to the runway is really an important task. And I mean, up in you and I are both from Detroit. There was an awful accident up at Detroit Metro Airport, where they got lost and they taxied onto a runway with heavy fog, and there was a terrible accident. And so you want to get that right. It's mundane, but you really want to get it right. Well, after I checked out as a captain, I mean, I hadn't been. I was probably 4 or 5 months in the left seat, and we were taxiing at DFW Airport, and my co-pilot challenged me and said, "We're supposed to turn here." And so we obviously, we stopped the brakes. I thought we were supposed to go up to the next taxi, but stop the airplane, call the tower, and it turns out that I was correct. But I turned to my co-pilot and I said, "Thank you for speaking up. Keep doing that." And so that's how you keep that culture moving forward. So when I challenge you on standard work and you say, "Well, no, it's been updated. See, this is the new." Okay, I'm sorry. No. Thank you. That's how we that's how we make this work. And so it does deflate some of the ego, perhaps, and it really focuses us on what's right and the facts.
Yeah. Well, and like you said, I mean, what's right for all the passengers sitting behind you, what's right for the crew, what's right for yourselves, and like you said, in the operating room, that question should be coming from the perspective of what's right for the patient. The patient would want us to make sure that we have enough units of blood before we start the procedure, and if it turns out we did have enough, I think that's a big cultural difference for someone to say thank you for asking. And so, you mentioned culture early on. I want to come back to this. I mean, it's how do you address it when you go into a hospital where it's one thing to say you're empowered, but people still might be scared to speak up, or what happens if somebody speaks up and the doctor does not listen or does not respond constructively? Are there expectations that you're setting, or that you're signing up senior management for, whether that's chief of surgery, chief medical officer? At what level do senior leaders really create that environment to say, well, if you don't respond properly, I mean, would they leap to say, well, we'll take your privileges away, or how does that play out generally?
So that's a great question, and we didn't, again, back in the early days, it didn't occur to us that we needed to do that, but we did figure it out because somebody would take the training seriously and would speak up, and then they got smacked down and abused, and hey, I'm not doing that anymore. So, one of the first things we do is we teach the course that you just discussed to the senior leadership of the organization, the executive level, the CEO, COO, chief medical officer, chief nursing officer, and then typically they'll begin in a particular department. So the chairs of the appropriate specialties, and then the department managers and such. So we teach the leadership the course, and then we continue. We have actually a 2-day offsite, if you will, where we go through those types of scenarios, and they create, they come to a consensus policies and a philosophy of, okay, if we're going to do this, this is how we're going to do it, and this is why we're going to do it. And so, and if we're going to do it this way, then we need to have policies in place to make sure that we actually are successful. So it is, and one of our guys has a great saying. People are watching. They're watching to see how the leadership of the organization responds, because it's not just that one person who's going to learn the lesson. Everybody's going to learn the lesson very quickly as to whether are we serious about this change in our culture.
Right. One other thing I want to talk about here, and we've got a couple of minutes. I mean, we could, maybe we can do a second podcast at some point down the road. I did want to talk a little bit about how you're combining lean methodologies and TeamSTEPPS and into what you're calling lean steps. I'm curious if you can talk about, kind of practically speaking, what some of the synergies are. You and I have agreed for a long while here. There's a high level of kind of conceptual and philosophical overlap. But what is that lean steps approach that you're
so
putting in place?
I should be clear that lean steps is really that's my Twitter name, and I'm the only one who uses that.
Oh, right.
But it's because I do think that either one on its own is great, but you really get a lot of synergy from an integrated approach. We've talked about the standardization, and they were both developed outside of healthcare. I think they both engender respect for people. They're both bottom-up methodologies. Now, you and I just talked about how essential the leadership actions are, but the fact is, the chief pilot at the airline is not there in the cockpit to make sure that things happen. That the first officer does speak up if it's if something's if they have a concern. That the flight attendant calls up and continues to advocate if they have a concern. And so it has to be implemented at the Gemba, if you will. Mm-hmm. And so both of them are very well aligned on that. They both are, hey, you have to measure the results or it doesn't matter, and servant leadership. So there's a lot of things that are very similar about the two. That said, TeamSTEPPS or CRM is very limited in its ability to address, material and supply, equipment, instrumentation issues, workspace organization and optimization, workflows, pathways, and engineering or ergonomics issues. And some of those, most of those are, the lean techniques and the lean philosophies are optimized and really handle those things well. Lean, on the other hand, has some challenges, as we've just discussed, with professional hierarchy, mm-hmm. Sometimes conflict resolution, unknown, unanticipated situations, recognizing unanticipated situations as they're developing, and so when we work with a hospital now, we don't prescribe anything until we go with them and look and see, well, okay, what's the problem? If they're bleeding on their supplies or on their case cards or that kind of thing, I can tell them how to have make an assertive statement or how to do team problem solving, decision making all I want. That's probably not going to fix those mm-hmm. case cards. Whereas, the lean techniques and the methodologies, they just give that to me. So we work with the leadership of the organization and say, well, here's what we think is where we would begin, and here's why. But we let them make those decisions. And typically, honestly, in today's environment, that begins with financial. Now, the leadership of the organizations these days is still, they understand the importance of the cultural piece, but the implementing some of the lean methodologies gets them the savings that they need right up front in order to continue to do this culture change. And so there is no cookie cutter approach. Mm-hmm. Every implementation has to be customized. There are some places where they say, look, I'm going to be losing people. I can't keep my nursing staff, I can't stay fully staffed here because of the toxic relations. Well, then maybe it makes more sense to shift and do more of the human interaction piece first and follow in with the lean, or perhaps do both. So it's helpful. I guess it's nice to have more tools in the toolbox to help address problems. There are some things that we would just kind of say, hey, we don't do that. We don't have an app for that. And so using some of the ideas of lean and the techniques really has helped us out a lot in helping our partners and therefore helping them help their patients.
Yeah, and thank you for pointing out. Thank you for sharing the concern. You're right. I should have asked the question in terms of lean plus TeamSTEPPS, and I'll link to a couple different articles and press releases that LifeWings has put out talking about that combination of lean and TeamSTEPPS. As we see so often, with lean plus whatever, that these different methodologies can be very complementary and very consistent. People might get confused by terminology, but they shouldn't be confused by like I said, I think there's very little. I don't know if there's any inconsistency in these approaches, which is why I'm so excited about it, and I know you are as well. So, I mean, we're at a point where my concern, unfortunately, is that we're running. Steve, my concern is that we're running out of time. So what I suggest we do is just wrap up, and then I know there's lots of other things I could ask you about. It's always nice talking to you, but maybe listeners will have follow-up questions. So maybe just ask you to wrap up. Do you have any final thoughts you would want to share, and maybe share some contact info so how people can find you online?
Sure. Yeah. I think you really nailed it in saying it's not one or the other. They are highly complementary. I'd be happy to visit with anybody about some of the things we've learned, some of the challenges they face, and whether I believe, if we've seen that, and anything that CRM can do to assist them on their lean journey. As far as my contact information, we are at saferpatients.com, and I'm Steve Montague. Steve Harden is our president. There's two Steves there, but Steve is very adept at discussing lean and CRM and understanding which one is appropriate where.
Well, good, and I'll post links to the website and to your Twitter account, which is @LeanSteps, and with 2 P's, and people can find you and hopefully reach out. So as always, it's always fascinating to hear what you're working on and to learn about the background with aviation safety, how that's being applied and how it's being combined with manufacturing practices. So really exciting times, and thank you again for talking about it here on the podcast. Well,
Mark, thanks for making the assertive statement, and thanks for having me on. I'm a big fan. I appreciate it.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thanks for listening. This has been the Lean Blog Podcast. For lean news and commentary updated daily, visit www.leanblog.org. If you have any questions or comments about this podcast, email Mark at leanpodcast@gmail.com.